Welcome to the AEI Education Podcast. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy studies here at AEI, and your host. Look, this podcast is simple. We bring on guests at the center of education research, policy, and practice issues that are affecting families, schools, and students. Today, we're launching the podcast on the day that the Supreme Court handed down one of the most influential verdicts for education policy in decades. In the Janus versus AFCSME case, Samuel Alito wrote the opinion that declared agency fees unconstitutional. This is going to be a major hit for public sector unions, and particularly for teachers' unions, the greatest interest group in education policy. We have two fantastic guests. First, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner came in to discuss this case, which his name is no longer on, but he launched just after being installed in 2015 as the governor of Illinois. To talk about this specifically in regards to education policy, we've also brought on Michigan State Professor Katharine Strunk, who's done a great deal of work with her colleagues on teachers' union strength and is going to discuss what Janus may mean for teachers' unions in the years to come. Without any further ado, let's get right to my interview with Governor Bruce Rauner. Governor Bruce Rauner, thank you for coming to AEI.
Great to be with you today.
It's a good day today. Earlier this morning, Justice Alito's opinion came out in the Janus case. You were at the court?
I was. We were there listening to the ruling. It was very exciting.
Very exciting. What was the milieu around the court on the steps afterwards?
A lot of excitement. A lot of folks out to support our side of the arguments. It was very exciting. Today was historic. Today, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of freedom of speech and freedom of affiliation for public sector employees across America.
Yep.
It was a wonderful ruling. They also ruled in a way that really helps taxpayers who have borne the burden of the unfair excessive cost that comes from the dynamic between government union leaders and the politicians that they work with and help elect.
Right, and this was your case a long time ago. It doesn't have your name on it anymore,
right.
But can you give me a little of the backstory?
Yeah.
When did you file it? Why'd you file it?
Yeah, so I became governor of Illinois in January of 2015. And in my first 3 weeks in office, I signed an executive order that ended the union dues collection for state employees who didn't want to be in the union, didn't want to pay the dues. And I sued AFCSME. So this was my original lawsuit. I sued AFCSME because I wanted to stop them from forcing state employees to pay dues that they didn't want to pay and that they didn't support. Mark Janus stepped up heroically. He and other state employees wanted to join, but Mark Janus had the strength of his conviction and the courage. He stepped up and joined my lawsuit, and then he ultimately became the lead plaintiff because he had been paying union dues. I had never had. I'm actually a volunteer as governor. I don't even take any compensation.
Right.
So he had the right standing, and he led the effort, and we all owe him an incredible debt of gratitude.
Right, and this was coming up. We've been paying attention to this here a lot, particularly me on teachers unions and focus on that. But in the original context, this is coming out of Illinois. Now, it's obviously a federal
this impacts
issue.
All states.
But my question is, did the genesis for this, was it something special about Illinois, or was it a national issue in your mind from the start?
Well, it's actually both. It is a huge national issue, but it's a huge issue in the state of Illinois. Illinois has had forced union dues payments since 1983. I've always believed that was a violation of government employees' freedom of speech for teachers as well as state and local employees. And now their freedom of speech is restored and their freedom to make their own political choices. What the judges, in essence, ruled is that the government unions, taxpayer-funded unions, are fundamentally different than private sector trade unions.
Yep.
They said that government unions, by their very nature, everything they do, every activity is political. It has ramifications for government policy, government spending, taxpayers, and to force anybody who disagrees with the union to fund that is a violation, forcing their political speech. They made the right decision on this.
Right. Now, I noticed, and I pay attention to this, I'm sort of an economist. Now, I noticed in the opinion today that it said that Mark Janus's dues were 78% of what union dues were. His agency fees were that much. Mm-hmm. And, my argument has been, without agency fees, the price of union membership effectively goes up dramatically because the alternative is now zero. So the question that I have for you is, Illinois specific or across the board, what do you think this is going to do to teachers' union, public sector union membership?
We'll see. Now, folks who don't want to be in a union are free to choose whether they fund that union or not. That's what our Constitution requires. That's what the Supreme Court ruled, and I think rightly so. I think the important thing to understand is government unions are different. Everything they do is political. In private sector trade unions, the majority of what they do is purely negotiating with an employer, has no impact on government policy, no impact on taxpayers. So separating out their political dues is appropriate. That distinction of fair share is appropriate in the private sector. Doesn't apply in government. All the dues have a political impact, and therefore requiring any to be paid is forced political speech and therefore unconstitutional.
Right. Now, did anything surprise you about the ruling? Any of the specifics that came out about it? Or were you expecting it to kind of come like in the form it did?
This is what we were hoping for and what we expected.
Right.
Our team is still reviewing all the nuance.
Sure.
I believe that the ruling was fairly broad and really very supportive. This ruling, some people will spin this as anti-union. This is not anti-union. No. This is pro-worker and pro-taxpayer. And pro-good government, and it's a historic, great victory.
Right. One of the notions in there that I did not expect to come out necessarily was Alito said, this is requires affirmative consent. You have to opt into the union. It's not you belong to the union if you opt out. I'm wondering if you expected that component, and if you think that's important or sort of secondary to the First Amendment issues, especially as it plays down to union strength moving forward.
Well, I think it is a very important part of the ruling. I did not anticipate that.
Right.
Our team is looking at the ramifications of that right now. That may have some significance. The core issue, though, that they correctly decided, the big decision is that all the activity of government unions is political, and therefore any dues of any type at any level is forced political speech. That is the correct ruling, and that is historic victory for public sector employees.
Right. In the dissent, which I still haven't been able to read in full because it's a long dissent, but Kagan says she writes a lot about saying, ABUD has been around for 40 years, and we have a bunch of contracts that are based on this, and there's going to be upheaval and change. Yeah. And I understand that doesn't necessarily trump First Amendment arguments, but even holding that trump card aside, how much change do you think we're in for in Illinois, across the nation?
Yes, I've heard these arguments, and some of the justices made it today when I was in the court, and I believe that argument is fundamentally wrong. It's false. Already, 28 states already don't force non-union members to fund union activity at any level, so this is already established. And in the federal government, for decades and decades, the federal government does not require federal employees who don't want to be in a union to fund any of the union activity at any level. Right. This is well established. It doesn't cause disruption. And the fact that there are certain contracts in place, those contracts will continue to exist. They'll be negotiated again when they're up. I do not see any massive disruption whatsoever.
Really? I focus on teachers' unions, and I've focused sort of on NEA membership and where it's gone of late. And I'll tell you, the states that have agency fees, they have a lot more teachers' union membership. I mean, they just are overrepresented. Yeah. So across the nation, I wonder, what do you think the broader downstream implications of this decision are? Beyond the individuals who are affected by this and some of the union members that may go along with the union speech, even though they might politically differ from them. What do you see as the long-term effects?
Well, we'll see what the outcome is. I know in Illinois, I have been approached by literally hundreds of public sector employees, teachers, local government employees, state employees, who've come to me and said they don't agree with their union, they don't want to be supportive of it, they don't want to fund it, and they feel like their rights are being violated. I heard this for years, and I heard it a lot when I was running for governor about 5-6 years ago. So we'll see how they ultimately choose. But, in America, America's about freedom fundamentally, and now their rights to freedom and free choice and affiliation and free speech has been restored to them as it rightfully should be.
Right. Well, how about the political dynamics? It's an open secret that unions favor Democrats, largely speaking. They have political alliances there. Their money flows there. Do you see political ramifications, either for the parties or for whether the unions may be able to loosen up on those affiliations, since this may be a linchpin that they sought for Democrats to keep in place?
Well, we'll see what the ramifications are over time. I really focus on what's good policy, what's good for taxpayers, what's good for employees, what's good for the people of Illinois. Right. And I believe this decision is good policy. It's constitutionally right and correct. This is good for our democracy in America and the state of Illinois. It's good for state employees. It's good for workers, and it's good for taxpayers. This is historic, positive development.
Right. Well, it's certain that 5 justices agree with you, and it's now the law of the land. You are facing re-election upcoming in 2018.
Re-election, I'm being challenged in November. That's right. You're
challenged, and I'm sure your opponent is going to use this sort of as an issue to try and wedge you against voters. How are things looking in the election campaign, and what should we look for after you're re-elected, I'm assuming?
Well, I have loved to serve the people of Illinois. It's a humbling, deeply, I appreciate it very much. I've enjoyed transforming government so it really works for the people, making government more efficient and effective, trying to reduce the tax burden, trying to make our economy more competitive through free enterprise and reducing the regulatory burden on our job creators. And this historic government ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court to impact government workers will allow me to work with the state employees to drive even more value for taxpayers and reform our government. This is a very exciting opportunity.
Yeah. Well, this opinion, no doubt, is going to be historic.
It is.
Changes the law of the land, changes big changes for the labor movement and for citizens as they choose to join or not.
That's right. Historic, positive change across America. Wonderful result for the people of Illinois. I'm very excited about today.
All right. Governor Rauner, thank you for coming by and talking with us.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Governor Rauner gave us a great, broad-based take on why Janus is important and why he sees it as such a victory. However, to get closer to the education policy issues and what this might mean for teachers' unions, I also had a conversation with Michigan State Professor Katharine Strunk. Katharine Strunk, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Katharine Strunk is the professor and Erickson Distinguished Chair in the Department of Educational Administration at Michigan State. How are things in Michigan today?
They are a little rainier than I'd like them to be, but other than that, it's summer in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, it's busy times here in D.C. with the Janus decision coming today and Alito finally getting to release the opinion I think he's been writing for 6 years or so. And then, of course, we've just had the news that Anthony Kennedy is retiring, but we'll leave that to the side and focus on Janus. You've done a lot of work on teachers' unions over the years, and I'm sure have been thinking quite a bit about this case in particular. So first, let's sort of zoom out and just try and give us a little bit of the lay of the land. How have opponents targeted public sector unions generally, teachers' unions specifically in the past, decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people would qualify what's been happening for the last decade or so as a war on teachers or an attack on teachers' unions. You can see that in the legislation that has been proposed and that has been passed. Brad Mariano, who is a co-author of mine and an ex-doctoral student of mine, has a really nice paper that shows that in almost every single state in the country over the last many years, there have been legislation at least proposed, if not passed, that is intended to weaken the ability of unions, teachers' unions, to bargain and the content of what they can bargain over, if not just completely weaken unions to begin with.
Right.
And, some of these things have been really impactful. So, for instance, 3 states in recent years have removed unions' rights to bargain, while 2 more already prohibited it. 23 states have started to require teaching effectiveness be used in tenure decisions. 43 states include now a student achievement as a factor in teacher performance measures. So these are all things that didn't happen before and have just been put into place through legislation in the last, sort of 7 to 10 years.
Right. And some of those seem to be more focused on the teaching profession and new requirements for teachers, maybe not so squarely on unions, but the collective bargaining restrictions are more squarely focused on unions.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that both, right? So I agree that more directly focused on unions, things like collective bargaining or some of the right to work legislation that has led us to Janus today. But things like tenure and sort of tenure that does not rely on measures of effectiveness, those are things that the union has fought for years and has claimed as very strong sort of tenets of what they do. And so changes to things like valuation and tenure, while not directly about teachers' unions, actually have served to affect the kinds of policies that unions have long fought for and protected.
Right. So when these sort of assaults have come down the line, how have unions reacted after they've been passed? I mean, what is their typical tack to react when collective bargaining is restricted, and how does that set the stage now that agency fees are unconstitutional?
Yeah. So I've not heard anyone yet say that it's unconstitutional. So that's
it's striking, isn't it?
Woo. So teachers' unions have reacted in several ways. I mean, one of the first things that has happened is when you take out certain things from the ability for unions to bargain over at the local level, unions bargain in other things, right? And so you can think of a contract as kind of a zero-sum document in some ways. So some of these documents range to 400 pages and contain everything about a teacher's workday that is possible in them. So how many hours they work, how many students they see, in which classes, how much prep time they have, lunch duty, recess duty, anything you can think about, how much leave they can take.
Yeah.
So when things are removed from the scope of collective bargaining, what we've seen in our work across 3 states, this is with Dan Goldhaber and Josh Cowan and many of our fantastic research team in Michigan, Washington, and California, we see that just the unions in the districts, and we shouldn't forget that districts are a key part of negotiating collective bargaining agreements, they bargain in other factors that make these that are kind of wins for unions and for teachers. And so where they may lose the right to bargain over the specifics of evaluation, say in Michigan or in Washington, they then increase the amount of content in the bargaining agreement over other areas, things like leaves or grievances.
Yeah, so they find alternative things to take up and carry the ball forward. That's a great sort of setup question for what agency fees do. So before we get into the question that I do want to ask you is there any way around these agency fees, the removal of agency fees, in the way that unions have found ways to get around collective bargaining restrictions? How important do you think agency fees are going to prove to be? I mean, some folks are saying, it's a blow to unions. Others are saying, this is a key plank to retaining union membership in these states where they have higher representations of teacher in the unions. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think, if you look at sort of the 2 states with the best data that have actually become right-to-work states in the recent years, Wisconsin and Michigan, you can sort of see the trends in membership, right? So both Wisconsin and Michigan have dramatically lost members over the last few years since the reforms have taken place in those states. So I think that will happen on a national level, and I think there are many reasons for it. One that you've talked about, Nat, that I think is correct is the delta now between what it would cost to join the union and not join the union, still have to pay an agency fee, has grown much bigger, right? So it used to be maybe a $75 difference or a $100 difference, and now it's going to be a $500 difference, right?
Right.
And so that will, change the calculation that an individual teacher makes about how worthwhile it is to join the union.
Right.
There's a free rider problem that was discussed extensively in the opinion for Janus and in the arguments around Janus. And now teachers who may not think they can afford to join the union this year can think, well, it's okay, someone else will join the union and the union will still protect me, and that's a classic sort of economic free rider problem. And then there are the people who are going to drop out of the union because they honestly don't believe what the union is doing is in their best interest or represents their beliefs, and it's kind of the First Amendment argument, and they're going to remove themselves from the union and stop paying dues. And I think all of those together will lead to pretty dramatic decrease in union membership over the next many years. With that decrease, we'll see a reduction in revenue for the union, and I think that'll hit at the local, state, and national levels, obviously, which will then affect their ability to affect policy at the local level through collective bargaining, but also at the state and national level through trying to impact legislation and lobbying and elections. So I think your question was sort of what are the long-term impacts of removal of agency fees going to be, and I think those are some of the most obvious ones.
Right.
And then your question was, how are unions maybe going to get around that? And I think you have to look a little deeper than kind of just the numbers in Michigan and Wisconsin and the precedent that we see there to think about what's going to happen. And I think even some of the language coming out of the AFT today, I think forecasts what the unions are going to have to do to really fight for their members, which is to really go back to what unions were first intended to do before they became the kind of powerhouses they are today, which is to really understand what their members want and need at the very basic level and fight for those things and really reconnect with their members and become the voice for their members and be very careful to not go beyond the specifics of what membership is asking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new day in my mind for unions to make their value proposition to members in a lot of states where they all of a sudden have to pay a good bit more for it. And I wonder what's going to happen to the culture of union membership. I mean, in some of these states, the percentages are pretty high. And so it's sort of the normal thing to do to join a union. I don't know if this is going to be large enough to impact that, but that certainly seems to be a threat.
I think it's a real threat. But, I think the culture of unionism maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's the culture of teacher professionalism, right? Has always been, okay, you're a teacher, you join the union in states like that are, agency shop states. Now the culture might really be about what is the professional role of a teacher. So how can the union make sure that I'm getting the things that I need to make sure my students are successful, right? So
Right.
It might still be that people join unions in those states to fight for things like preparation time in their day, right? Or to fight for the time to have fewer students in the classrooms, not because it's easier to teach smaller classes, but because they believe maybe it's the best thing for kids. But it might also mean, and I think this is something we're going to be able to watch really closely, is how much CBAs change now. So, and how much is locally driven. So what might be right for some teachers in a given district to think that the union should fight for them and for their kids might look very different now than what they see 3 districts over that face a very different context. And so where we used to see that these contracts looked pretty similar
Right.
in sort of these local areas, you might start to see much more divergence among what people fight for in their contracts.
What can we learn from right-to-work states, not the ones like Michigan, Wisconsin that have recently changed, but that have been right-to-work for some time? They have lower rates of union membership. But I mean, a big part of the conversation in the opinion and the dissent was, this is going to make a huge change in thousands of contracts, and that having a reasonably stably funded public sector union is essential to stable labor peace and government relations with labor. So what do we know? Because we do have a majority of states that don't allow agency fees. So is there anything we can learn from them? Are they totally different sort of dynamics?
I mean, I think they're pretty different. I always get frustrated when people sort of want to do a straight comparison of a union state versus a non-union state, or a right-to-work state versus an agency shop state, and say, look, we can tell so much about the differences between these, between being union or non-union based on these states, and that's just not true, right? I mean, there are many historical and endogenous reasons that have created states to be perpetually right-to-work versus agency shop states, right? So there's just differences between those two states, and they're not good comparison groups for each other. So, we can learn from things in right-to-work states. As you say, there seems to be the ability for districts to negotiate with their teachers in a relatively efficient or at least functional manner in places where, right-to-work has been the precedent for the last, however many years.
Right.
So that can be done. It will likely change the way many districts have to negotiate with their unions if suddenly membership drops in certain districts to the point where fewer people are actually members than are not, right? Or opposite, right? Few people are not members. And so we can see that what happens when suddenly unions decertify, or what happens when we just don't have any one group that can represent the teachers, and suddenly every teacher is going to negotiate for themselves. And there's some work actually that I think is relevant out of Wisconsin that's very preliminary, so I'm not going to cite it directly, but that shows actually that some teachers do sort of choose to move to districts where they can negotiate for themselves, and other kinds of teachers stay in the districts where they're negotiated for by the union, because there are different preferences of these teachers. And what does that mean then for the sorting of teachers equitably across districts and even across states at some point?
Wow, that's interesting. I can't wait until that becomes more public so I can examine it. But moving on, the red state strikes that we've seen this spring, I mean, they were a huge news item. They were unexpected. They garnered significant raises in West Virginia, Arizona, and multiple states. What do you make of Janus with that as the background and the potential for the future of teachers' unions with those red state strikes as opposed to what we might think of without them?
Yeah. I don't know that I would argue the red state strikes were completely unexpected. I think that there's been a growing feeling of discontent in many of those states that education has been perpetually underfunded and undervalued, and the legislatures in those states were not acting in ways that were making public or teachers feel like that was not the case. And, teachers can't really strike and win if the public isn't at least somewhat behind them.
Right.
And so in those states, I think we saw sort of a wave rising, and I think a lot of us who've been looking at this over time could sort of see where we would expect some of those strikes to happen. And, things like states that had salary schedules that are dictated at the state level and things like that were remaining low. In the context of Janus, I think, one real possibility is we start to see even more teacher union activism. So as in some of those states, they were actually more grassroots than even just the local union striking. What we might see now is that the union sees as one of its roles to actually help organize teachers to fight against really terrible conditions in schools or what the people believe are underfunding or undervaluing of teachers and educators. And, Brad and I joked about our piece in Ed Next that maybe we should title it Rise Up, and that this is going to be a time post-Janus where if unions are strategic about it, they might be able to actually create more power for themselves in some ways to do that kind of thing.
Right. The silver lining argument. Well, who's to tell? We're going to have to wait and see. I'm not going to ask you for a number, but people are throwing around lots of numbers as far as, the teachers union is going to be cut in half, or it's just going to be a blip and they're going to lose 10%. The NEA predicted that over the next 2 years, they're going to drop 10% of members. Two questions here. The first is that in the opinion that came out today, the court said that public sector union membership has to be affirmatively consented to. In other words, we have to have members opt in. How big of a additional factor do you think that will be? And do you think unions were anticipating that? It seemed to me like it was not a done deal.
I don't know if unions were anticipating it. I wasn't necessarily anticipating that. And that seems like it's even one step further than they were required to go. And, if you follow their logic and their arguments, right? So it seems to me that this is actually a really big deal. So opting in is always, you can look at the behavioral economics work. You can look at what unions are even saying in Michigan, right, when you talk to them. The opting in thing is actually really troublesome for unions. So no longer can they just say, look, you have to actually sign some paper or even press this button on your website or whatever it is in order to not pay agency fees. Now you actually have to, decide that you want to pay membership dues and why. And that could be even just from the facts that this may not just be easy to do, right? It might be that getting all the teachers to do this just logistically is difficult, and then you lose some membership and some dues just for that reason alone. From it actually creates someone to say, well, how do I value the extra $700 a year?
Right.
And what else could I purchase with that before I click this button? And then there's actually a thought process that goes into it.
I agree with you. I think it's
a really big deal.
An important sleeper line in the opinion that's really going to play out over the next years. And it also sort of sets the table for other lawsuits waiting like Yon and so forth to come. I don't even know if they'll make it there because it almost predicts the ruling so clearly.
I agree.
So when to get back to what you were saying about collective bargaining, when one path is blocked, another one is sought out by unions often. That makes sense. Is there a alternative route for teachers' unions on agency fees, especially just to try and minimize the losses? Or is this a broad enough hurdle that there may not be any clearer way to get around it?
I don't think we know yet. So you can think about some of the cities and, the mayors or the state governors that are talking about supporting labor and what at the state level could people put into policy that makes it less bad, right? So could you have a could a city say or a district say we're going to have a required meeting of every single teacher at the beginning of the year in which we explain, we let the union come in and explain to them the importance of membership and give them a piece of paper right then and there that says I will, pay my membership.
Right, like they did in New York State.
Like they did in New York,
yep.
Right? And so I think that we might see things like that happen in certain states, especially states that there's a strong labor vote for the in state government.
Right.
So I would expect that in New York or maybe a state like California.
Well, it's a historic ruling, certainly changes the landscape for public sector labor. How do you think it affects how teachers can be represented? Is this just generally negative for teachers in that unions are going to be smaller? Are there possibilities that representation could sort of improve or be more locally directed? What do you think?
Again, I do think there's an opportunity here for teachers' unions at the local level to focus their representation even better and actually gain some membership that they would have expected to lose. So, for instance, if in an urban context, teachers are really feeling like they don't care about, or they don't care first and foremost about political activity on the state level, and that's not what they want to put their membership to them, but they want their union to go to bat for them about 3 or 4 different things that are not in their contract right now, or that, new teachers come in and, they're 5% of the workforce or whatever, they're 10% of the workforce if they're in the first 3 or 4 years, and they really want to go to bat for new induction supports. That might be something now that the teachers union has to pay attention to and think pretty seriously about how do we now represent all of our members and the members that we most need to have join. So one opinion that I've heard around today that I think is probably right is that unions will have to think a lot more about new members and that new teachers, because the old teachers who've been there for a long time, they may be just used to paying their dues and they may understand the value of a union. But you get a teacher in his or her first year who's never been represented by a union before, doesn't know what there is to lose or gain. The union might really have to push for those teachers to show them what they can bring for them at the table, which might mean higher starting salaries relative to the traditional backloading we see in districts and things like that.
Well, you've done great work that I've paid attention to. You recently had a piece with Mariano and Ed Next that I'll refer all our listeners to kind of looking forward on what will happen on the outflow of Janus. And the good news, at least for you and I, is that there will be plenty to study in the years to come on the outflow of this case, no doubt.
Good news. That is true. There will be a lot to look at for the next generation of union scholars.
All right. Well, Katharine, thanks again for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nat.
Thanks for joining us on the AEI Education Podcast. And special thanks to Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner and to Katharine Strunk for lending her expertise. For more research and commentary on Janus, head to AEI.org. Type Janus in the search bar, and you can predict what you think will happen to teachers' union membership in the 5 years after Janus. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.